Hello everyone, this is part 38 of What If Naruto Got Lost During His Training TS, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. A large force was spotted north of the rice field border. The stationed Oto Anbu could see a line of ships out on the horizon, a massive army steadily making its way toward the coastline of the country. The land of rice fields was ruled by Orochimaru himself, after receiving information that Hai no Kuni had suffered from mistakes made by some of the elites in the country. He had disposed of the daimyo of rice fields, taking up the mantle for himself. Having full control of the land, he had access to the military of the somewhat prosperous nation. One could say that military diversity-wise he was somewhat on par with Rosuto no Kuni in that regard. His numerous experiments making up a large bulk of his foot soldier forces. The man had a habit of not really giving much importance to lives other than his own. To him all life was expendable, save for his own. He had delusions of grandeur, believing in his superiority over whatever obstacles would stand in his way. He still had many aces up his sleeves, but did not think that any of them were needed to repel the forces planning on attacking his own country. He had received some reports from psychics in his employ that attacks against Hai no Kuni had already been launched. The reports told the story of Hai barely holding on to their position as the strongest nation in the continent. They were losing, slowly, and pitifully. The invading forces proving to be far too much for them to handle. While the fighting did look like it was progressing slowly, that was simply just the tip of the iceberg. The invading Rosuto no Kuni forces were simply battering down the resistance, in a relaxed manner. They were sure of their victory, they fought with the ferocity of true warriors while the defenders simply fought for their home, a home that had been hit hard in its very heart. Hai was being pummeled on its western borders as well as on its southern border, so Orochimaru decided that it would be a good idea to help the invaders, maybe curry a little favor from them. He would send some of his forces to make minced meat out of the defenders of the northern border of Hai no Kuni. An action which he hoped would place him in the good graces of the invaders, well enough within it to be granted some of the secrets of the land of the lost, a land forgotten by history and time, and the rest of the continent. After reports from his northern border were sent to his office, he immediately sent out orders to his shinobi forces, orders to attack the Hai no Kuni border. Take no prisoners, and them all. Incentives were issued out. The more of the Hai forces that were dealt with, the more of the helpless members of their families were spared the horrors of experimentation and war. Orochimaru may not know how to value the lives of others, but he knew that others valued the lives of their loved ones. Unfortunately, Orochimaru never really got to understand the concept of having a loved one. His goals were always geared towards the acquisition of power, and all that came with it, including a form of immortality. The forces that he ordered to be sent to the northern border were made up mostly of the lower-ranked shinobi forces as well as the regular soldiers in the country's army. They could be considered simply as the meat shields of the military of the rice field nation. They were ordered and sent out to attempt to delay the inevitable from occurring. Orochimaru's standards, as well as any other minor country's standards, for their military was a lot higher than the five greats. They had to contend with the might of the five greats, which prompted them to have a more quality-based training than a mediocre one, like the other larger nations. The truth was that the five had good quality and the numbers to be great, but the minor lands did not have the numbers, but they more than made up for it in their quality. They were a force to be reckoned with, if they were only given a chance to shine. The impending invasion of Ricefield would give her warriors the chance to shine. Their mettle even greater than the greater counterparts. They had more to lose than the larger nations, as they had so little to begin with. The little that they had in possession of, was far greater than the tracts of wealth that the larger nations sometimes chose to squander about. So, they would fight with their all, not holding back in the slightest, as all they had was in danger of vanishing from the face of the world. There was everything to lose, but the future to gain. Orochimaru's experimentations with the blood of the Shodaime Hokage were not all failures. There were a select few samples that had been kept in stasis for such an occasion. He only made the first successful creation known to his compatriots in Konoha, but the others he hid away, waiting for a time that their talents would be needed. It would not do to have all of one's pawns go out in battle, all of one's strategies be known, for the world to form counters, and prepare against their use. Since the Rosuto navy was still a few miles out at sea, even though their numbers were something not to look forward to facing, Orochimaru deployed his Mokuton users, and had them create a fortified barrier. One that would prove challenging to break through, even for the invading Rosuto forces, whose abilities were still mostly unknown to the Rose Field men and women. Orochimaru had 50 men and women, and a few more along the way, as well as a few more in reserve. In recent years, the Serpentine Man had found some ways to make his experiments more of a success, which helped bolster his power. He also had some of his agents steal some technology from countries steeped in advanced technology like snow, lightning, and rain. His forces had some machinery at the disposal, like cannon and weapon launchers. His genin forces, which were at least Chunin in strength, were equipped not only with their chakra attacks but also with these so-called launchers. From the hidden village known as Hidden Sky, a nation whose technology allowed them to gain the power of flight through the use of chakra had also been stolen by agents of Orochimaru. The man had incorporated the use in the training of the forces of the land of Rice Field. Most of these things were done while the former ruler was still in power, all of which was in preparation for Orochimaru's bid for international power. He was a serpent that liked to plan things out. He made sure that he had contingency plans for all the likely events to happen during his lifetime, a life that he believed would span till the end of time. He knew that there would come a time in his future that someone out there in the world would challenge his supremacy. He had planned, and done things in preparation for such a likely event. His planning had apparently pulled off, and he was more than ready to take on the unknown forces of the Land of the Lost. The flying, or more like gliding, technology would allow the military forces to proceed to have aerial assaults on their adversaries. He made sure to send some competent people to lead his armies, having handpicked them himself. The barrier that the Mokuton users were to create had 3 levels. As Orochimaru had received word of how the battle at the southern end of Hi-no-Kuni had gone about, he decided to have his northern border defended in 3 layers. The first layer being built out at sea, the first wall was to be formed a couple of meters away from the shoreline. Cannons were to be mounted on them, and manned by non-shinobi personnel. To help defend these soldiers would be the gliders that would provide aerial support. The second layer of defense was to be set up on the shoreline, right where the sands met the salt water. Another set of cannons would be mounted there, once again manned by non-shinobi personnel. Their support would be made up of men with launchers as well as a few gliders. The third defense line, the one before and other manner of defense, before the fighters of a land battle, was another wall, another barrier, one that also would have cannons mounted on it, manned by the same class of personnel as the other 2 walls. But this time there would be a lot more support for the wall. As this third wall was to be considered the more or less last line of defense of the coast. Orochimaru knew not to underestimate his enemy, just as his former home had underestimated their enemies. So sure of themselves and the daunted power that they had not fallen to many of life's adversities, but when faced with the unknown, they had overestimated their own worth, and underestimated the unknown which resulted in the war that was about to take the known parts of the continent by storm. As Orochimaru surveyed the running of his country, as well as the defense preparations, and the attacks that had commenced, Tsukiko, her daughter, and their forces were also preparing for the battles ahead. They too knew not to underestimate the serpent and his armies. They knew what a cornered animal was capable of, which was further enhanced by the cornering something or someone, that was not a mere animal, but a monster of a man. One that was worthy of their attention, but not worthy of a continued existence. The war, the invasion and decimation of Hi-no-Kuni was the perfect excuse to rid the world of the abomination known as Orochimaru. The navy had yet to begin the invasion, as the preparations, as well as all the checks were still incomplete. Even though word had reached them that the signal to start the invasion had been received, they decided to take their time. They had the confidence in their capabilities, as well as their troops' abilities, that they would win the battles ahead. They knew that even though they were granting their enemy a longer time to prepare, to better their forces, to become harder to beat. But they also knew that they loved a challenge. They weren't all Juashu, but they were good enough to be assigned the task to eradicating the serpent menace, Orochimaru. The ships were all lined up, but not in a single line like the one that the Southern Navy had formed. These ships were lined up in 3 layers just as their enemy had chosen to be. The frontmost line of ships consisted of the speedboats, whose sailors and soldiers concentrated on getting in and out of situations the quickest way possible, while still being able to deal a significant amount of damage. The second row consisted of ships that were slightly slower in speed, but were in charge of dealing the most amount of damage from a rather long range. These ships hosted a number of powerful cannons, whose elemental chakra firepower was enough to level a small village with little to no effort. The third and last row of ships consisted of all the cargo and personal ships. These things contained all the manpower and supplied of the northern attack contingent. Tsukiko and Yoshiko's flagships were among these ships. It was the biggest one of the lot, as well as housed the main communications department of the Navy. Preparations are complete, Commander, one of the officers that had entered the commander's cabin reported. Assess the field of battle. We still need more information on what we are dealing with, Tsukiko ordered. Orochimaru is still one of the unknowns in this war. No matter what information we have been working with, we still need to make sure on what we are dealing with, Yoshiko added. Hi, the officer said as he saluted and left the cabin to send out underwater patrols to see what the defenses were actually like. The Super Crocs were mobilized, along with the diver partners. They were then ordered to go as near as they could get, without starting the fighting, to assess the defenses of the country that they were preparing to assault. The Corks and their partners that were sent out were given explicit instructions to remain undetected, but even with this warning, they were not aware of all the things that were happening. The aerial support that the Navy had was rather limited. The rocks were not to be deployed before the land campaign had commenced. The sensors and scouts that the Navy had at its employ were not perfect. They were unaware that they were being watched from the skies. Some of the glider units had been sent out to survey the invaders. They were high enough to not be detectable by their enemy. Unfortunately for them, they witnessed the deployment of the Crocs. Assuming that it was an attacking force, they made their way back to base camp. Traveling faster than the underwater scouts were. Arriving at their base camp, they informed their superiors of the impending attack force that was being sent to the first wall. The officers reacted by ordering their lesser officers to send out some people that could attack from underwater. Drop some mines into the water, cloaked or hidden under illusions, that would automatically detonate and blast the attacking force out of the water, way before they would reach the wall. The Otonins that were adept at fighting in, on, with water, were sent out with the explosives that would be used as traps to blow away, and up, the invaders long before they would be able to do any damage to the walls. This action would impede the information-gathering efforts of the invaders greatly, as not only would the Rosuto forces lose a number of its underwater attack force, but also valuable information that they would have been able to collect had they survived the impending explosions. The Crocs Corps were cautious in their approach, knowing that there was a possibility of being found out, or that their enemy had laid some traps for them ahead of time. On their way, they encountered little to no resistance. They were able to swim close enough to survey the walls, and the armaments found on them. But as some of them decided to move closer, some of them were surprised with what they had found. There were some underwater patrols, which they assumed had been there for quite some time. This prompted the scouting force to beat a rapid retreat. But in their hurry they were unable to avoid some of the traps that had been set up in their escape routes. The explosions overrode some of the conditioning and training that the Croc Corps had undergone, which caused a significant number of them to panic, and react by swimming into the traps. The apparent plan of the Otonins had succeeded and they were able to rid themselves of a considerable number of invader forces. Once the explosions were seen and heard, and the first sign of bloodshed was witnessed, the rice field forces prepared themselves for succeeding attacks, while at the same time deploying a few aerial units to send some death dealing to the enemy forces while they scrambled to assess the situation that they found themselves in. What the hell happened out there? Tsukiko asked her officers. They were only meant to scout out the defenses, not run into them. Calm down, Okasama, Yoshiko said, a little bit frustrated at their first number of casualties. We were able to get some information from the survivors of the scouting party, but not enough to properly form a strategy or plan of attack with, one of the officers said. Well, at least we have something to work on, Tsukiko said. Inform us then. The first wall that we have encountered is defended by a number of illusioned and underwater mines that explode on impact. There are also a number of cannons mounted on the wall, one of the officers reported. Some of the divers were able to spot what looked like gliders in the air, which possibly means that the enemy is capable of aerial attacks, making them on par with our forces, another officer continued. There is also the technology which some of the gliders look to have in their possession, another officer said. What technology would that be, Captain? Yoshiko asked. Some kind of miniature cannon, an artillery launcher if you will, the officer answered. So they have a kind of gun, interesting. Tsukiko commented. What are our orders, commanders? The officers prompted. Add at least one mage per speed boat, we need sensors to pick up any abnormalities in the water, as well as another mage to monitor the skies, Tsukiko ordered. Send in the first wave, with as much speed as possible, I want to lose as little as possible. Blow up any detected explosives, have someone on board with firepower to spare to do such actions, Yoshiko said. We could use their defenses to our advantage, make it seem like some of our forces were annihilated by their traps. A slight change in plans, I want 3 mages per boat, 1 to detect mines in the water, 1 to monitor the skies, and 1 to cover the boats in illusions should the mines be triggered by one of our troops, Tsukiko stated. You have your orders, dismissed. Yoshiko said. Hi. The officers said and departed the cabin. After being equipped with mages, and some additional firepower, the speedboats were signaled to begin the real initial attack that had been planned by the commanders of the northern forces. The boats made their way swiftly towards the first wall. It had to be breached before the second wall could be accessed. They made their way across the water, cutting across the waves, creating ones of their own. They were machines of true speed, speeding their way towards their targets. Aside from the 3 mages, each boat had a unit of 5 soldiers, each one with a rocket launcher. The rockets were packed with explosives charged with elemental chakra. The resulting explosion would be able to blow a hole in wall that defended Konoha. Not a big hole, but enough shots could bring down a part of the wall. The boats made their way to the wall as fast as their engines could move them, the mages doing their jobs, some successfully blowing up the mines and covering themselves, preparing for a stealthy attacks. While others weren't as lucky, the mages, still being human, were not perfect and in some cases were unable to shield their boats from the mines that they were tasked to find. The mages that monitored the skies were luckier, as they were simply the guide for the pilots of the boats, informing them when a glider was closing in on their position for an attack. The boats had been instructed to focus on the wall, and avoid the gliders and the mines. Unnecessary use of ammunition was prohibited. In that regard, there were some boats that were unable to escape their pursuers. They were able to damage the wall, but in turn they were killed in action. Not all of the deployed boats were able to safely make it back to the rest of the navy. Some that escaped did not escape unscathed. Damage to the boats was almost unavoidable, and some lives were lost on the way forward and back to the rest of the fleet. Report. Tsukiko said. We have unfortunately sustained a heavy number of casualties. 57% of the personnel that we sent out are unable to fight, while 35% have passed on, an officer stated. The mages were able to keep damages to the boats to a minimum, but some lost their lives defending their comrades, another officer reported. The speedboats are good for getting in some hits, but it seems that the enemy has some intel on our forces. We need a change in tactics, another officer supplied. Okasama. Yoshiko said, unsure of what her mother was thinking after hearing such reports. I want 5 men to a boat, send them in, 1 full-powered rocket to 1 launcher, 3 mages to a boat, 1 to detect the mines, 1 to monitor the skies, and 1 to erect shielding, Tsukiko said after some thought. 1 soldier to man the launcher. The target is still the wall. The speed freaks are to control their boats to the best of their abilities, make the hit, and return, 1 shot per boat. Hi. The officers said. Once a boat returns to the fleet, I want them rearmed and sent back into the fray. We need a steady stream of fire hitting that wall, Tsukiko continued. It doesn't matter where the rocket hits, as long as it hits the wall. Hi. The officers confirmed their understanding. After the speed freaks have left the line, send out the second row. I want them to bombard the wall with continuous fire, hit the first wall with everything they've got. I want that wall brought down, Tsukiko said. When the second line runs out of firepower, they are further ordered to remain in place. We will send additional supply to them, but they must remain in place to hold the line, Yoshiko added. Hi. You have your orders, the mother and daughter team said, dismissed. The speed freaks were then deployed, and were harassed by the gliders, but due to their having shields protecting them, casualties were lessened significantly. The defenders were unable to land any more solid hits. The walls stood firm under the ant bite-like fire that the speed freaks were employing. No matter what the defenders did, they were unable to do any more damage to the attackers. The mounted cannons commenced firing once they realized that the gliders were no longer doing any more damage. Try as they might, they were unable to even dent the boats that were speeding here and there all across the aquatic battlefield. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.